Welcome to Stress-Free IEP. You do not need to do it all alone. With your host, Frances Schefter, Principal of Schefter Law. You can get more details and catch prior episodes at www.schefterlaw.com. The Stress-Free IEP video podcast is also posted on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can listen to episodes through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Stress-Free IEP, Frances Schefter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our show. Today's guest is Nicole Rouleau with Igniting Your Mind, which is an executive functioning coaching and consulting business. So, Nicole, tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for having me. I have been in the education world for a little over 18 years, and I mainly worked with middle school, high school students. And one thing that I noticed, I'm going to say over the last 10 years, was that our students that struggled with many different learning differences, not just ADHD, dyslexia, anxiety, autism, I've worked with all of those types of students, is that they were lacking what we now know as executive functioning skills. And they were really struggling once graduating high school to launch to the next level. And so that was something that, I saw it. I have been doing part-time support, part-time coaching for about 8 years or so, while working full-time as an executive function learning specialist in the school setting. And what I realized was that there was a missing link. If we don't support our parents and we don't support the teachers, we can coach our students till we're blue in the face, and it's not going to make much of a difference. So I decided to, about a year and a half ago, just embark on this journey of let me try to do this full time. Let me see if I can do this full time and put like all of my heart and soul into it. I'm very passionate about supporting students and getting them to the point where they are independent and they recognize the abilities they have within themselves, because it's possible. So that's what's landed me where I am. I resigned from my job back in late 2021, and I decided I'm just going to 2022, and I decided to just launch this business on my own and just see what happens. And it's been great so far. Yeah.
That is awesome, amazing, because it is.
Yeah.
It's something that's definitely needed because the schools do what they can. For those that might be listening that aren't quite sure what executive functioning skills are, can you elaborate on those a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the textbook definition about it's a cognitive process, but that is basically what it is. What we have and what we know about executive functioning skills is that they grow and they develop at different levels based on our needs. So generally, with most of our children, right around from 5 to 7 years is when our executive functions start to develop, and that happens in our prefrontal cortex, which is the top upstairs brain, as I like to call it. And what that basically is the idea of being able to access self-direction, goal-directed persistence. The idea is that if you have executive functioning skills, you don't need to be prompted and reminded to do all of the important things. So there's a lot of components that go into it. I don't want to get too sciencey on anybody, but the development of it starts in the working memory component. And we have nonverbal and we have verbal working memory. That's where it begins. So it's visualization and self-talk. And so that's really where executive functioning begins and essentially what it is. And we also have the idea of emotional regulation, and we have the idea of cognitive flexibility. So those are the 3 big executive functioning skills. And there's just so many other life skills that are interwoven into that.
Right, it is. And it's just, thinking about like IEP process and stuff with executive functioning skills, you can't. I mean, can you? You can't. There's no way you could get everything that needs to be taught in executive functioning skills onto an IEP because as is, they're 50 pages long and like trying to write goals for everything. So do you have suggestions for like parents that have IEPs of like what to focus on in school?
Yeah. So I have done actually professional development for many teachers over the years as well. When I've worked in schools, I've sort of always been pulled in to do the executive function, professional development. And where I've always wanted to focus and where teachers need to focus, which then can obviously translate to how it can look in an IEP, is again to focus on those nonverbal, verbal working memory skills, which is the idea of visualizing and self-talking through what needs to happen in terms of tasks. We know that for our students that have ADHD and autism and have anxiety and different learning differences, they really struggle to get started, to initiate a task. And what happens is that so many teachers, so many schools focus on the external behaviors and what that looks like on the outside, which it looks like laziness. It looks like they don't care. And really at the core root of that are usually a lack of executive functioning skills. So where I would tell parents to really want to focus on that in terms of how it could be written, how goals can be written into an IEP, is that we want to be focusing on a couple of things. One, what does the end result look like of any task? So a lot of times I do this when I coach my students, and I do it when I coach my parents, is I like to think of it like, let's picture what an ice cream sundae looks like when it's done, right? What's the done product look like? We can picture the amazing whipped cream and the ice cream, all of that. And so then we can go, well, what do we need to get there? And we can easily work backwards and think about what we need to do to get there. And then that helps us to then move forward. So it's kind of like working with the end in mind, essentially. And that actually, that one sort of strategy comes from Sarah Ward, who's a wonderful, she's a speech and language, but she's an executive function expert. And a lot of my strategies that I implement have come from her. So I wanted to give her credit. But it's the idea of helping, if we can write into goals, into the IEPs, what does the end product look like? How can we help our students to task initiate and get started? A lot of that is self-awareness. They don't know the passing of time. They need to be really thinking about how things look when they're done before they get started. And then the other thing that I think is really important that is not talked about enough is prompt dependence, right? So we see all of these goals, and what ends up happening is when you really read them and you see how they're being implemented, we're having our kids work on organization, but we have a case manager or a learning specialist who is then organizing the child's backpack, because there's only so many hours in the day, right?
Right.
But we're not ever teaching the child how to do that. So one thing I tell parents all the time is when you're thinking about how goals should look in the IEP, we always want to think of the scaffolded approach, where there's a lot of support in the beginning and we slowly release the responsibility to the student as they gain skills. So when I work with a lot of the IEPs and I do a lot of meetings with schools, is I always want to make sure that language looks like a lot of support until the skill is built and developed. And how are we releasing that responsibility to the student once they've shown independence?
That makes sense. Right. Reverse engineering it. And what automatically popped in my head is like independently, or, like the goal of independently keep book bag organized. And then the objectives of like within 3 prompts, within 2 prompts, so the fading prompt is, I've seen that a lot, and that's used a lot.
Mm-hmm.
There's been, I don't know if you've seen this also, but I've seen a lot of times in schools and stuff that, schools are like, well, we want them to be independent, so we can't have them so dependent on us. I'm like, yes, we want them to be independent, but we need to teach them how to become independent. It's not like you just learn how to be independent, right?
No. And that's the hardest part, is that all of these things, I mean, we have this buzzword executive functioning, but it's their skills. Our kids are not born with these skills. We're born with the potential to develop these skills with the right coaching, with the right environment. I like to tell parents, you can be your child's coach, but you need to learn the skill. And it's a tricky thing, because we expect our kids to just sort of naturally develop these. And for some kids, they can develop them. But for some, and I'm seeing this is something, I'm sure you've seen this, is where executive function skills, or, a deficit, they are very tightly woven to ADHD. So if you have ADHD, you have executive function developmental disability, essentially, or a delay, let's say. But what I'm seeing, and what I had seen, as a full-time teacher for years, was that we have students nowadays that don't have a learning difference, that don't have a diagnosed disability, and they have executive function deficits. Why is that? And how is it being addressed?
Right.
It's such a wide range. I mean, I coach students from, 10, 12 years old all the way up to adult age. But where I really see it being such a huge issue is our high school and college students. Because there's so much expected of them. There's so much independence expected of them. But if they've never learned these skills, they're floundering.
Right. And it's so
Yeah.
true because in elementary school there's a lot more coddling and teaching and holding hands because they're just learning. And then middle school you're expected to, have more independence and be able to do it on your own a little bit more. And then high school they're like, well, they have to be independent and boom, throw them to the wolves. Unless you're lucky enough that your school has a resource room that's appropriately done. And I say that because so many people have a resource room that winds up just being a homework help, not like teaching the executive functioning skills and saying like, okay, show me what you've done, so that you're fading that out.
Yeah.
Uh,
Show me, don't tell me, right?
exactly,
That's a
exactly.
hard one. But that's something to think about too, is that yes, we have these resource rooms, but one thing that I struggle with my students, especially my middle school students, which is really where you start to see these deficits, right? Where there's more expectations put on
Yep.
them. The transition into middle school is really difficult for so many of our kids. And I hate bringing up COVID, but I have to bring it up because what I'm seeing is that for our seventh and eighth grade kids, there's now writing curriculums that were not in place through COVID.
Right.
And so now that there's such a higher expectation, and we have these curriculums where kids are held to grammar standards that they didn't learn those foundational skills in fifth and sixth grade. So now our middle school students are really struggling with that. But what I'm seeing is that those kids, those middle schoolers, do not want to look different. So
Right.
they're not going to go to a resource room because
Right.
they need the support. They don't want to look different. So really, where can we empower these skills is to have our teachers know this information. And kids, yeah, they need a brain break. They need to get up and move. But can we have a space in the general ed classroom that allows all of our students to take a brain break when they need it, not just because they have ADHD or a learning difference,
Right.
you know?
And it makes
So
sense. Yeah, like I
yeah,
remember when I went and got my master's in special ed and I went back and learning all these teaching techniques and I'm like, I've been teaching for 4 years already in gen ed. Why didn't they teach this to us in undergrad in the gen ed courses? Because yes, they're geared towards special ed, but it's just good teaching.
yeah,
Like it
yeah,
just like if like I just imagine if the teachers are trained and not putting more on teachers because I know they're enough, but if the teachers have it worked built into the curriculum, it's going to lessen their workload in the long run because it's not going to be needed on the IEPs, or it'll still be on the IEPs, but you're naturally already implementing the
yeah,
IEP
yeah.
and learning how to
And the
do
hard,
that.
yeah, for sure. And then one of the hardest things is when I go to these IEP meetings to support a family, to support a student. When I talk to the teachers about the strategies that I offer, I'll say to them, it will help all of your students, I promise.
Right.
Like, do it for everybody. So it's like the idea of a lot of these students who can't get started and they just lay their head down. Oh, they're being oppositional. Let's do an
Right.
FBA. They have behaviors. But the truth is that they just don't know how to get started. It feels too hard. It feels like it's going to take too long.
It's too
Um, and
overwhelming.
it's overwhelming. Exactly. And let's not forget when we go, I've talked a little bit about the working memory component. We start out with a certain amount of working memory every day, and it depletes as the day goes on. So if you're
Right.
noticing that your kids are having behaviors in, the later part of the day after lunch, that makes perfect sense. They're running out of working memory skills. And it's really,
Right.
really hard for them to be able to kind of stick it through. So when teachers can do things to reduce the cognitive load, like give strategy sheets, talk about what the end product looks like of any task, then let's work backwards. It gives the kids a picture to work from. And
Right.
chances are, I mean, I've done this with many, many students over the last 12, 15 years. They get started, they figure it out,
Right.
but they have to have that visualization and they have to talk through the plan. So it's kind
Makes
of like,
sense.
we talk about, oh, well, a lot of times our parents will say to me, my kids can't keep their room clean. Let's talk about what a clean bedroom looks like. Let's
Exactly.
visualize that clean bedroom. Now let's work through what steps we need to take to get there. So,
Right.
IEPs will say things like frequent check-ins and breaking down tasks. But I would like to say, what does that look like in the classroom?
Exactly.
And that's what we're
That's
missing in the IEPs, right?
Well, they're not
Yeah.
if they're done correctly. So
Mm.
in Maryland, at least, in DC, also, well, not DC as much. No, I don't remember if they changed theirs again. Maryland, for each supplementary aid, there's supposed to be clarification of location and manner. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves right now because people put across all settings. Like, how is that clarifying location and manner? So, like, for example, preferential seating. That's going to look different for everyone. So what I like to put in the clarification of location and manner is to be determined by the student and the teacher at the beginning of each course, like not every day, but like at the beginning of each semester, because in one class it might be away from the door, in another class it might be away from the window, and it depends, and the cohort of the classroom matters. So
Right.
it's supposed to be clarified. Location and manner. What I say at IEP meetings often is I'll say, look, here's the idea. If we all win the lottery and say, peace out, we're going to Jamaica tomorrow, can somebody else pick up the IEP and know exactly what to do for this child? What is that exactly going to look like? And so that's where, like, right now, that's where I am. And like, we need to beef up these IEPs and need to be, and that's not putting more on the teachers, because the teachers are already doing it. The teachers do all this stuff. It's just getting it in writing on the IEP so the next people know what to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've seen that with the preferential seating for many years as an older school teacher who doesn't have the training in knowing, and
Yep.
it's not their fault. They don't know. I mean, they're not trained in some of these things, right? And or they don't have the verbiage, right? But what that looks like, I've seen this over the last several years, is that a lot of teachers think it's front and center. But front
Yep.
and center does not work for an impulsive kid with ADHD, because you're going to be
Right.
teaching to the back of his head. So
Yep.
it's kind of like, and then also, like, we know that our kids with executive function deficits probably have cognitive distortions. They probably don't believe in themselves. There's a mindset tied to this. And so if we can allow them to have choice and some control over things, you're going to have more buy-in and you're going to get more out of those kids. Johnny, where do you think the best place is for you to sit? And then how do we teach monitoring, self-monitoring, which is a critical skill that falls under executive functioning, is let's talk about this in a week. Let's see how this is going for you. And then what we're doing is we're modeling the monitoring, and we're allowing that child to go, yeah, you know what? It's not working for me. Can we try something else? Because that's another skill that, unfortunately, it's not really, really taught in schools. And
Right. And
so our
it's,
kids
you know,
don't
it
know
just,
how to check on themselves. They don't know how to check.
right. And it just makes
Yeah.
so much sense of, like, I didn't even think of it on that level of the autonomy of giving the kid like that choice and developing and buying into it more. Because it also helps them to advocate for themselves.
So yeah,
Uh, like thinking
make
about,
decisions.
right, coping strategies is one that
Mhm.
we have often, is have a list of coping strategies. Well, what does that look like? And it's the student and the counselor or whoever they're working with will develop a list of coping strategies and have it accessible to the child on a regular basis. So again, let the kid buy into it, because then, obviously we all know kids are going to buy into it more if they're involved in the planning of it.
Oh yeah.
We can talk till we're blue in the face telling a kid what to do, and if they don't want to do it, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, imagine, I think this works for adults as well, is, if you're told you have to do something from a boss, that's going to mean a little bit different than if your boss said, do you want to do this or this?
right.
Or, you got to do the thing, you got to do something, but would you rather do this or would you rather do this? So it's
Yeah.
always about pushing that sort of accountability and, of course, self-advocacy, but also a lot of our kids with executive function weaknesses are going to struggle to make decisions. That's one of the biggest challenges I have with my high school and college students, is that they don't know how to make decisions. And
Yeah.
they need to make a lot of decisions at that age.
Right.
So if they've never been, and again, it's a skill, right? So if we're not teaching it, if we're not modeling it and teaching it, it does not happen. So that's another reason. That's another thing. Speaking of the IEP accommodations and things that I think work for students that struggle in this way is, if we're going to do a modification like less problems on a page, if they're going to have reduced homework or reduced workload, you give them a math page with 10 problems and you tell them to choose any 8.
Mm,
What is that doing when they're allowed to have that choice? How is that helping them? It's letting them choose the 8 that they feel most comfortable with. They feel like they're a little bit more in control, and then they're going to pretty much cross out the 2 that feel the hardest for them. We're still demonstrating the knowledge, we're allowing them to make the decision, and they have some control. And so that's where we see that students the ones who take initiative, the ones who don't need to be prompted through their entire day, and we know which students those are, the ones that have to be
right.
tapped on the shoulder 24/7. The ones who don't need to be are the ones who have had the opportunities to make choices and have a sense of agency.
Right.
So I really
Yeah,
think
so
that that's
important.
something that we want to focus on in the IEP is having those goals set up to allow that as well, anywhere possible.
Right. No, it's true. It gets frustrating though. With our middle and high school students, I always have that conversation in the balancing act because, as you said, we know middle school and high school don't want to look different. They don't want to be pulled out. They don't want to be in the resource rooms. If the resource room isn't run right, if the teachers aren't taught right, it's kind of like the school can only do too much, so much. And I've told clients before, more than, or potential clients technically, more than once, like, hey, yes, you can pay me. I can go in and get you up the perfect IEP. The
Mhm.
reality, though, is how it's going to be implemented. Even though it's required legally, it might not be implemented the way it needs to be. And so I'll tell them, like, honestly, take your money, go hire an executive functioning coach, hire a language therapist, somebody that specializes in dyslexia, whatever that is, and do it on the outside. Whereas
Mhm.
we don't necessarily want our kids to be doing more education on the outside, but you also don't want them missing the curriculum because especially our kids with ADHD, autism, anxiety, and all of that, they're going to fall farther behind, and all that work you just did to bring them up is just going to slip them back down
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. It's difficult.
So,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
For sure. And I also think, we have this kind of push to there is more of a push to address the executive functioning skills. Like I'm seeing a lot of schools that are creating an executive function class, right? They follow a
right,
curriculum. But again, we're not teaching self awareness and time awareness. We're not teaching awareness at all. We're just teaching, let's talk about time management. But we can't
right,
teach kids to manage their time if they don't know how time passes. So schools, unfortunately, are missing a critical step. And I wonder if they are creating these executive function classes to check a box to make it look like they're doing
right.
something, right?
Oh,
But
yeah,
then we also have the schools that are so focused on the standardized test and teaching the academic, delivering that academic content to teach to the standardized test. Are they really focusing? Do they think that executive functioning skills are non academic? I think there's a lot of administrators out there that think it's non academic.
right. And they don't realize
So,
I mean, part of executive functioning skills is learning how to take a test,
yeah,
knowing how to take a
absolutely.
test, knowing how to,
Metacognition.
right, exactly. I remember in the LSAT, training for the LSAT, how they're like, don't spend too much time on one individual problem. Stop, go on to the next one, and then go back. Because you're going to spend
Yeah,
all that time on that problem figuring it out, and you're going to miss the next three. Whereas the next three might be easier that you can finish and then go back to the harder one. And if you don't do that one, that's fine. You just didn't do one instead of three more.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I had never been taught that. And I was in my late 20s when I took my late 20s. Yeah. When I took my took the LSAT. So you know what I mean? So I had gone through all of life and never realized of being taught that. And I'm assuming that's what they do like in the SAT prep courses and stuff is teach kids
Yeah,
how to study and how to take a test.
right. Yeah, I mean, there's an element to understanding the content and being able to pull that information out. But I used to actually do SAT prep and ACT prep years ago when I was a full time teacher trying to make that extra money to pay my
Right.
bills. And yeah, I mean, there's a huge element to test taking strategies, but there's also the idea of we put a lot of emotional ties to like what is being asked. And at the end of the day, it's really application. There's really
Right.
some science behind and math really behind how you approach an exam and how you can be really successful at it. It's a lot easier than a lot of people think. But I
Right.
always say, like, think about all the skills that we need, life skills, right? Anytime the word skill is attached to anything, it's got to be something that's taught and learned. And that's the
Exactly.
thing is that we need to be teaching these executive function skills to our children explicitly in order for them to really learn it. They're not going to learn it otherwise. Um,
Right.
you know, why do all
Yeah.
of our students have such a struggle with planning and prioritizing because they've never been taught how to use a planner. Then they go to college and they don't even know how to plan anything. They don't know how to
Right.
prioritize. Um, and so they don't have a system. And then there's that idea of like we have goals, right? But at the end of the day, if we don't have a habit to support that goal or ways or systems to support that goal, we're not going to get there. Or maybe we get there once, but then we don't continue.
Right.
Chaos ensues after the fact. But I mean, there's a lot of things that I think need to be improved in terms of how we can build executive functioning into an IEP. Um,
Yeah.
but we need more support, I think, from administration, more support from the schools. Our teachers need to be trained. You know how many
Right.
hours of PD I used to do as a teacher?
How
They
many?
could easily create some great courses for us to learn these
Right.
executive function skills.
Yeah, like
You'd
I'm
be
thinking back.
surprised.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to my teaching days, and like I remember most of the time the PDs that they required us to do or they brought in were like not really useful, you know?
No.
And
Yeah.
you're required to do all this stuff. I don't know what they are now. It's been quite a long time since I taught. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just, but it totally makes sense because you look at it and like, and I think about the emotional dysregulation also. Like with kids, we teach them how to tie their shoe. We teach them how to brush their teeth. We teach them how to
Right.
use a fork. We need to teach them emotional regulation and we need to teach them executive functioning because, at
Yeah.
least by modeling. And then I think about home and teachers and how many parents and teachers and everybody else have ADHD as well or on the spectrum. And if they don't have it or they don't have that skill, they're not able to teach it. So how do
Yeah.
we come in and fix that issue?
Right.
Is
Well, I
another.
can say that, right, for sure. I mean, that's definitely a component. And again, our teachers didn't become teachers knowing how to de-escalate a student. In
Exactly.
fact, I think where it really comes into play is focusing on the foundational skills, right? Like we always need to focus. We always sort of like skip a couple steps and then jump in, and it's not going to work because we didn't, really focus on the foundation. But I'm a huge proponent for co-regulation and the idea that we have to connect with our students before we can expect them to comply, before we can expect to have any kind of discipline in the classroom. We have to know that they have to know that we understand and accept them. And I
Right.
always did a great job. I loved working with my middle and high school students. And people would say to me, "How do you deal with that age group? How do you do it?" And I'm just like, because I get down on their level and I understand them and I accept them, even if I don't fully understand it. They think I do. But it's such an important thing to have that connection for them to know that they have you. You
Right.
kids will learn from you if you connect with them.
Yep. That's so
But there's
true. And
this right.
yeah, I was just gonna say I taught middle and high school at an alternative middle and high school, and like I remember my classroom. I don't like middle school. I did not like middle school, but my high school kids, and I remember there's this one class, and they were just like, the kids. They're an alternative. They're court ordered to be there most of the time. Most of them are not the kids that are learning naturally and stuff. And I remember walking into the class one day, and I'm like, okay, all of you have an A right now. And they're all looking at me like, what? What? And I'm like, you all have an A right now. And they're like, okay. I'm like, now you got to keep it.
Yeah.
Can I tell you the
Mhm.
difference in the kids in just that one thing? Because they knew they had an A. Like, oh, dang. They didn't have to earn an A. They started with an A. Now just keeping it.
Mhm.
It's basically the same skills and doing the same thing. It's just how you're presenting it.
It is, right. And I mean, there's a lot of, and that's another thing that I think teachers need to, they need to have these trainings. They need to learn
Right.
this. I have a lot of people, I have a Facebook group, a private Facebook group that I created about a year ago for my current clients, my past clients, just to give them a little extra support, right, when I'm not meeting with them. And a year later, it's become 12.5 thousand members. And so now there's a lot of teachers in there, which I think is amazing because they are trying to learn these skills. And the way that I would teach it to parents is similar to how I would teach it to teachers as well. But a lot of it is in the verbiage, and they don't always realize. For example, here's another IEP goal that I've read many times, and I'm just like, or accommodation essentially is if so and so has questions, or ask if they have questions. But I have seen this in practice. If you say to a student, um, Joe, do you have questions? They're probably going to say no because they don't
Yep.
want to look weak in front of their peers. They don't want to look
Mm-hmm.
different. But if you go up to them and you say, "What questions do you have?" you're causing them to really dig in deep and think about that. And so I'm a
Exactly.
huge fan of reflexive questioning, which is really helping them to attach how they feel to certain things and just kind of learn those critical thinking because we just don't have critical thinking skills nowadays. Combined with the
Right.
fact that our students aren't resilient, they can't persevere. Um, and I have my speculations for why that is, but we need to be teaching that. We need to be teaching delayed gratification. We don't always get what we want right away,
Yeah, our kids
and
don't know that these days
they don't
at
know it.
all.
That's
No.
why we have our students who can't work under, they don't have any frustration tolerance. So how do we build that? How do we help them to learn that they can sit for 5 minutes and try to figure this problem out without giving up?
Right.
Again, these are all tied to executive function skills without
Yeah.
even realizing it.
The patience
So
is crazy. My kids all the time, they'll ask me a question. I say, I'm not sure. They're like, well, ask Siri then. It's like
yeah,
at the time, we have it right there. And, it's not like, oh, well, let's go get the encyclopedia and let's go look it up. Like when I grew up, that we didn't have the
absolutely,
internet. But yeah,
absolutely.
it's a lot of skills you don't even think about that we learned naturally because we didn't have the technology.
Yeah.
And the kids
You know
now
what the
need to
num
be taught it. Yeah.
Yeah, the number one thing that I always tell my parents that I work with is you have to allow your kids to be bored.
Oh God.
That's the problem.
Yes.
That's the problem because as parents, we have this inherent guilt that if our kids are bored, we have to entertain them. And we can't always entertain
Right.
them. So we go, here's an iPad,
Yep.
here's the TV.
Yep.
And it's not, unfortunately, it's not the parent's job to have to entertain their child. Um,
Right.
Go outside. Unstructured play. And there's so much scientific evidence that talks about unstructured playtime outside can naturally develop executive functioning skills. How is that?
Right.
Well, we
Yeah.
all kind of, people, I mean, yeah, we have our people that are our age group, probably that have ADHD and struggle with some of these things. But in general, we probably have more executive function skills overall than our younger generations,
Right.
and there's a reason for that. I spent a lot of time outside when I was younger, even
Yeah.
if I
And so
didn't
do
like it. It was like you got kicked out of school, out of your house when you got
exactly.
home from school, right?
Yep. Come
So
home when the street lights are on. you know.
yeah, exactly.
No, it's
So
true. It's hard though, because today's world is different and it's not quite as safe to do that depending on where you're living,
it is true.
unfortunately. But it's true. Like I just think about it with my kids. I talk about my kids a lot on the show about when they say they're bored. I'm like, okay, so go clean your room. I don't want to do that. Okay, so here's another option. Go clean the kitchen. I don't want to do that. Okay, so you figure out something to do. And they realize like, okay, because like I'm fine. I'll go clean. I'll help you clean your room. Let's clean. And that's not what they want to do. And that just puts it back on them to figure out something to do. Um,
Absolutely.
I always give them, like, I don't give them, oh, why don't you play with your Barbies or why don't you play a game or anything like the fun stuff. I give them the stuff I know they're not going to want to do. So it makes them think of, like, oh, wait, what do I want to do?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I'll
you
have
know,
I'll have students a lot of times brainstorm in the moment of boredom. What are the activities that we can do? Let's get a visual list. Because again, anytime we want to have our children, because a lot of times our children are like truly don't know. They don't know what to do because they've never had to really try to be bored and try to just like come up with their own ideas. But so a lot of my students that I coach, especially my younger ones, will brainstorm a visual list of all of the things that you can do that don't involve tech. That if you're feeling kind of bored, what can you do? Can you draw? Can you play Legos? Can you go outside? Can you walk your dog? Like there's a lot of things you can do. But truly, the kids go to their parents and go, I'm bored. I don't know what to do. Well, you
or
got
the
your
parents.
list. So pick an activity off of that. And that helps them to rely less on their working memory, right? Because they're
Right.
not able to hold that piece in mind. So the more things we can externalize, the more systems that we can, put into place for them. And that's really not a hard thing for teachers. Going back to the IEP situation, that's not a hard thing for teachers to implement. A lot of teachers are already given their kids formula sheets and strategy sheets so they can know what they need to do to complete something, like say in math.
Right.
They're already doing these things, but
And
like,
I was
is
gonna
it
say, it
consistent?
saves,
It may not be
right.
consistent though.
And it saves time in the long run anyway, because like if
Yeah,
you have it there, you're not going to have the questions. So
yeah,
like let's teach it, and then you're only going to get the questions that are like the deeper questions that they really need explanation. If you have a task analysis of like do this, do this, do this.
hmm
I know some of the schools teach it like, okay, you need to come up with your topic sentence. Now you need to take notes while you're reading, and that's due on Wednesday. And then your outlines due on Thursday or whatever, however they do it, they teach that. But that doesn't happen all of the time in the schools, naturally,
exactly. And that's what I see is I
unfortunately.
think the biggest concern is the consistency.
Yeah.
Because there's not a framework for teachers. There's no system that they follow even, right? You're just sometimes as a teacher, you're trying to just keep your head above water.
Well, you're given,
They're
here's your
they're
math,
working hard.
right. Here's your math curriculum, here's your reading curriculum, here's your science curriculum, here's your social studies. Now
hmm
teach it all. It's not intertwined. There's no, here's your
hmm
behavior system, like none of that
Yeah.
classroom management stuff. But
And
that's
yeah,
where, yeah,
that's yeah. And that's
Very
another thing too,
negative.
is that we don't see enough classroom management, and how can we teach executive function skills and emotional regulation skills where it comes to classroom management.
Right.
There's a lot of things we can do. But the other thing with executive functioning skills that I think is overlooked in the school setting is learning perspective and situational awareness. You know, I used to have a student that would announce himself. He'd come into school late. I taught first period, and believe it or not, it was an executive function class. And he just couldn't, he was not a good sleeper. He was late every day to school. He came in consistently 15 minutes late every single day. And when he would come in, he would announce himself. Hello, I'm here, everybody. He had no situational awareness to what was going on. And he needed to be taught that. But what he didn't need to be taught that because I emailed his parents and said he's in trouble, or he's staying for detention,
Right.
or he's got a lunch detention. He needed to be taught that in the moment. And this is where executive function skills are developed, is in the moment where there's context. It needs to be taught at the point of performance. And that is something that is much, much overlooked, in my opinion. So, for example, what I did one day, because I knew it was going to happen, so I prepared myself for this. I gave my students a job, gave them all something to do. And I said, when this boy comes in, I'm going to pull him out in the hallway, and I'm going to tell him right before he gets a chance to do that, I'm going to tell him to read the room. I'm going to tell him to look around and see what's going on. Do you know, from that day on, and this is the truth, he never had that problem again.
Right.
He
I'm
just
sure.
needed to be taught that in the moment.
He didn't know.
He wasn't in
Yeah.
trouble. He needed situational awareness. And
if you get him
again,
in,
where we go,
right.
Mhm.
I was gonna say, if you got him in trouble and punished him, he would probably continue doing it. Because
Right.
not that he didn't know better, but like, yeah, whatever, I'll have
Right.
detention,
Yeah. And a lot of those kids with those types of behaviors, the detention doesn't mean anything anyway. And if they do stop the
Exactly.
behavior, it's out of fear. It's not teaching a skill. And
Right.
believe me, I'm not one of those people, those parents that thinks that kids shouldn't have consequences. I definitely believe in that. However, that situation, he needed to know what message he was sending to his peers when he was doing those behaviors.
Right.
And that's one of the things that our kids with executive function weaknesses lack. They don't know
Yeah.
what that, and that's a great question to ask. Parents can ask that, teachers can ask that in the moment. When you act this way, do you know what message you're sending to your peer? Do you know how your actions impact other people? Chances are
Right.
they don't know.
Nope.
They truly don't know.
Yeah, because they're just in their
So,
world. Oh,
right.
I know we could
So
talk
going
about
back
this
to Ross,
all
sure.
day. I was gonna say.
Yes, I was going to say, going
No.
back to Ross Green's quote is, children do well if they can, right? So we know
Yeah.
that every behavior they have, they're doing it based on the skill set that they have. So
Right.
we have to build more awareness around this.
That's so true.
You know.
Yeah. So I want everybody to find out, like, where are you based out of?
So right now I live in Florida. I was
Okay.
based out of for years and years, and I taught mainline Philadelphia for a long time. But when I decided to do this out and kind of grow this business and be out on my own and leave the school sector, I was like, why not do it in an area that I love and that's
Yeah.
warm? And so I live just like not far from Sarasota.
Okay.
But I work with families all over the country, and a lot of my clients are still from up north, just because I have a really good network up there. So,
Makes sense. Yeah, I love Florida.
yeah.
I was down there that's where I taught. I taught down in Miami.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So great. So you're in Florida, and I know we're gonna put all your information in the notes. But like, for somebody that might be watching this and going, well, I don't know if I need her help. I don't know. What are some key things that they might want to look at? Just like a couple quick things of like, hey, if your kid is doing this, call me.
Yeah. So what I like to tell families, and I think it's an important thing to really think about, is we want to put attention to the behaviors that are going to keep our kids from becoming 22 solid members of society, good functioning members of society. And so if you're seeing behaviors and you think about this and go, well, my child's really struggling to emotionally regulate, they have tantrums on the daily, that's probably a behavior that we want to think about. That they can't go do that when they're 22 years old, when they have a job. They can't do it. Other behaviors that we see that are really going to keep them from being successful and being independent, those are the behaviors we want to be thinking about focusing on. And I also think that so many of our students, whether it's an ADHD student or a student with any kind of an executive function developmental delay, right, for whatever reason, they are told so many negative things their whole life. And so it's a really tricky thing, because we see a lot of anxiety come kind of with this. Could it be comorbid with ADHD? Sure, it could, but we don't know about the chicken or the egg. I mean, I know if I couldn't manage my time, couldn't stay organized, couldn't find anything, I probably have some anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
So I often tell parents, talk to me. Let's just I do complimentary calls all the time. Let's just have a phone call and see if the anxiety could potentially be coming from an executive function weakness. So I work with a lot of families. I do, like I said, I do truly believe that parents can be their coaches. So I do a lot of parent coaching to get them to teach these skills in the natural environment. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that executive function coaches can do, and we all sort of have a different background, right? We all sort of have a different educational background. But at the end of the day, my job is to build self-awareness. I don't help students with a planner. I don't say, let's learn how to plan. Let's organize. It's about self-awareness. It's about building those verbal and nonverbal working memory skills. And it's about teaching regulation and flexibility. So that's the core root of where I build my coaching programs.
That is awesome.
If we have a parent who's really struggling with their student's IEP and they're not getting what they think they need, I do a lot of collaboration in that way too. So sort of full circle. We're all a team, right? To help our kids be as independent as they can be.
Exactly.
So,
we're all a community.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. Thank you so much, Nicole. This was so wonderful. I love, like, every time I talk to different people, even in the same fields, it's always a different show, Yeah. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And I'm here. So anybody who needs me, I'm here to help out. Super passionate about this. There's more of a need, I feel like, now than ever. So yeah.
You've been listening to Stress Free IEP with your host, Frances Schefter. Remember, you do not need to do it all alone. You can reach Frances through schefterlaw.com, where prior episodes are also posted. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others through YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.